My name is Matthew Rose. I'm one of the editors of Brave New Europe. I don't know how one does an introduction for Steve Keen. He held a talk yesterday at the MMT Congress. I don't even know where to begin with the accomplishments. He probably became best known after the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009, which he predicted. Other people just said, well, there's something coming. But Steve said what's coming and why it was coming, and it all proved to be very correct. Steve was one of the first economists who brought economics and climate change together, and the connection between the two.
When you look at the beginnings of the research on climate change, it's all about the carbon dioxide trapping heat, which the experiments, I think it's Artenius, I've forgotten the name of the female scientist who first discovered this back in the 1850s. But the fact that carbon dioxide traps heat was known by experiments just by irradiating a tube of gas, of different gases, and see whether the temperature rose or not. And of course, if a gas was transparent to infrared light, then it would just pass through without heating it up. So oxygen on its own, no effect. Oxygen with carbon dioxide, the temperature rose. So we know that particular semi-mechanical role of carbon dioxide right from the 1850s. If you want to see where climate change work, in a sense, began in terms of looking how it impact human civilization, that was The Limits to Growth, written in 1972. And that book was the very first public exposition of a model in what's called system dynamics. So, and they had a bunch of MIT engineers, so one of the greatest engineers of all time, J. Forrester, designed the technology, which led to a model he wrote himself called World 2. And then he handed over to his students at that time, Dana Meadows, her husband, whose name I've forgotten temporarily, and Jürgen Randers is still alive and kicking. And they produced the Limits to Growth report. And what that did was say, looking at 5 major systems in the economy. So population was one, food production another, industrial output, health and pollution. Those are the 5 factors. And what they did they worked with quite a number of global experts on different aspects. So population experts, pollution experts, agricultural experts, and so on. And they then developed an index of data beginning in 1900. So they took various data series on agriculture, pollution, industrial output, life expectancy, and so on, put them all together. And they then set up the model, so the model could roughly reproduce that index data from 1900 to 1970. And then they ran it forwards from 1970 forward. And they deliberately, when they plotted what this model predicted, they deliberately began the x-axis at 1900 and finished it at 2100 and had no dividing lines in the middle. And they explicitly wrote in the book itself that we are not making a prediction for particular times for this to happen. Model's too general, too simple to be able to do that properly. So we're just showing what the trends imply, and what that trends implied and what they call business as usual. So you had how we were behaving as a civilization, population growth and industrial output and so on from 1900, continue forward to 1970, and just keep on going on that track. And what that predicted that was roughly a population peak and collapse, an industrial output peak and collapse, a pollution peak and collapse sometime in the early 2100s, between 2100 and 2150, roughly speaking. So that was the beginning of climate change science, in a sense, and that's when the Economist got involved. That was William Nordhaus. And he dived in and rubbished the work of the Limits to Growth in a paper that he called Measurement Without Data, and denigrated them on having no data whatsoever in their study, probably without knowing that they had about a 500 or 600 page book of all the work they'd done with scientists to set those indices up in the first place, which they published after the popular book came out. So we go back. So Economist is in there right at the beginning, and the role of the Economist, specifically William Nordhaus, was to say this is garbage, doesn't matter, there's no danger, capitalism can continue on indefinitely.
All right. But let's not do the 1 millionth podcast about data and follow the science and everything will be fine. There's another problem. I think a lot of us knew it was there, or were very conscious that it was there. Yeah. But I think one event has changed everything, although I don't think it's quite arrived yet in the consciousness of many people, which is the current genocide in Palestine. Because, we have the scientific side, climate side, we have the economics, which you fear are one of the leaders in and still are. But we now have the third element, and that's the political, where I would say if you're willing to accept, and this is what the West is very willing to accept, the death of 2 million, 3 million, 6 million people in Palestine, then why would you care about what's going to happen, the consequences of climate change, especially as the first people are going to be hit by climate change in the Pacific Islands? And they all have dark skin. In Africa, they all have dark skin. Why would the West, to put it in colloquial, why would the political class in the West give a fuck about it? Like, this climate change.
I've said this quite a few times in public talks that I've given. The West won't worry about climate change and lots of white people die in a white country. So if you have 50 million Texans die of a combination of climate disasters, or there's a wipeout of food crops and Europeans, particularly English, starve, then they'll take it seriously. But not until something like happens. When it happens to brown people in the third world, they won't give a shit.
We're talking about what the Americans would call white trash, because you have people who have lots of money. The billionaires, they're all buying estates on Hawaii and New Zealand, and creating bunkers, as we know, is occurring, and just assuming don't matter about all these other people. I will be all right. I don't know if they've really worked this through. What the consequence? It's like an atomic war. If you survived in a bunker,
you're sorry you haven't died.
Yeah, exactly. So, but anyway, I don't think these people are intelligent enough to think this through.
This is one of my favorite lines in the movie Don't Look Up, which was Jennifer Lawrence's when she's hanging out with those skateboard riders at one point. And people, typical conspiracy theorist types that you see on Twitter all the bloody time. I had a fight with one this morning. They were talking about how they think this is being planned by the elite. And Jennifer says, guys, the truth is way more depressing. These people aren't smart enough to be as evil as you give them credit for. So I think we're just stumbling our way into the biggest crisis in the history of humanity.
All right. But this is, in my opinion, an element that we have to bring in to the discussion, because it's not only about climate change. It's not only about, with capitalism. The people in degrowth have been brilliant in this, where they said, it's all about capitalism. And as long as this capitalism is the root cause of
I push back a bit on that because of what the Soviet Union did when it was power, the Baikal Lake and some of the disasters that were done there. It's basically the real problem is not so capitalism per se, but the belief we can continue having economic growth on a finite planet.
But isn't that what the socialists were saying in Russia as well?
But they were doing the same thing.
Exactly.
Classic, the people who wouldn't remember Khrushchev these days, but the classic speech where he took up his shoe to bang it on the United Nations table and say, we will bury you. What he meant, we'll bury you in consumer goods. We will produce more consumer output than you do, and we will have much wealthier working class people than you have, and that's how we'll bury you, by growing faster than you can do. Now, of course, he was quite wrong about the actual dynamics of Soviet production at the time, and I've done work on that as well. But that was the basic orientation of both extremes, was to continue growth. And by growth, to lift everybody up to a high enough standard of living, of the people at the very bottom would still have a decent standard of living. But that implies you can continue extracting energy resources from the planet, stored solar power in the form of fossil fuels, and burning it indefinitely. And now we're seeing that simply isn't physically possible. So I think any human social system which is focused upon growth rather than focused upon not letting the dominant predator on the planet wipe out the planet, that's the problem.
Now, I think we've gotten this far. At least, I think the progressive discussion, at least, has gotten this far. As they say, this whole beginning, listen to the science. That was, what all the climate people, that was their motto. Where I don't think politics gives a shit about the science.
Well, they don't have a clue, and this is one reason that my work on climate change is I only started doing it in 2000, I think, or maybe even 2019, after I read Richard Toll's paper called The Economics Impacts of Climate Change. And I realized what absolute garbage they were pumping out, what total absolute bullshit that they were pumping out. And that was trivializing the dangers of climate change. So that's when I got involved in that. And now I've lost my bloody train of thought on the previous comment. That's right. The science. Well, what I thought before I started looking at The Economist, and a lot of my progressive friends told me the same thing. I said, Steve, don't bother reading that neoclassical shit on climate change. All you'll find is they've taken what the scientists have said about the impacts of climate change and they've applied a high discount rate to it.
Right.
And I remember I've forgotten it, but at least two people wrote to me, like, good friends. So it may have been like Louis Philippe Rochon. Hi, Louis. Yeah, but I doubted it was probably somebody else, and a woman in Germany as well. Both wrote the same thing. And I said, look, okay, you might be right. Might just be a high discount rate, but at least I need to read it to find out. So then I started reading this paper, The Economic Impacts of Climate Change by Richard Toll, and I thought it's far worse. It's far more stupid than that. They've actually made up their own numbers about climate change based on the belief that you can predict the future impact of climate change by looking at the relationship between temperature and GDP per day on this planet now. What through time? That's where the dangers came from.
Getting back to the politicians who make the decisions, indirectly make the decisions. They're being dictated to.
But what I think they're doing, this is why I'm pushing the point. I think what they did is exactly the same belief that my progressive friends had and that I had, that economists have taken the research scientists, applied a high discount rate and trivialized the dangers that way. That'd be good. That'd be really good. But instead they've made up their own stupid numbers, completely ignoring the scientists. And because the politicians also think, like my friends did, that, there's go scientists, economists telling the politicians what to do with too high a discount rate. So we just need to discuss a higher discount rate. In fact, the economists make up complete bullshit about climate change, the sort of stuff a climate denier would publish. In fact, they get republished by Bjorn Lomborg all the time. Lomborg quotes them. So the politicians probably, I'm trying to work out how stupid people think here. They probably think, because scientists have done this work, economists assisted, it's trivial stuff that's going to hit in 100 years' time, somebody else's problem. I've got to go in front of the cameras and pretend I care about it, make some nice statements, then walk away and continue licensing new oil and gas and coal mines and stuff like that, and get, we'll end up being hired by the coal lobby when I retire from politics.
Which is exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
It's and the interesting thing is, we're seeing a parallel process right now in the West, which is a criminalization of the people who oppose the genocide in Gaza, but we're also seeing a massive criminalization of people who are actually actively opposing climate change. Roger Hallam and the other five
being in jail, sent to jail for attending a Zoom meeting where he wasn't even part of the group organising the idea of blocking a motorway, and he gets 5 years in jail.
Amazing. And you're getting the same sort of sentences or similar sentences for people who oppose
what's happening in Palestine.
In Palestine. So you can say, well, follow the science. You can also say, follow the truth, follow justice. And the repression by the political class in the West is massive, and in the state and mainstream corporate media, exactly the same thing. You have simply, what they always denigrate, fake news, everything's fake news. That's all they're producing right now is fake news, and anything that contradicts it is. We're seeing it now is being criminalized. They're going right into the area of media as well, and arresting people, sending people to jail. So we're now in, I think, a state of all three elements are coming together. Going back to economics just for a moment, please, Steve. It's not only climate change. Any sort of, let's say, not neoclassical economists, they've been sidelined. They've been pushed out of universities. They've been pushed out of publishing, whatever. And it's created a monopoly of the discourse.
By the mainstream.
So it's happening everywhere in our society, and I think we're just not that aware of it. And it's even gotten to the point where if you make a comment, a like on Twitter, you can lose your job.
It's forgotten who it was in Australia, a woman, I can't think of her name, unfortunately, I'm not in Australia anymore, but she liked a tweet, I think by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or some group like that, and for her trouble for liking a tweet, she was sacked by the OVC.
Right.
Now, she's now fighting back, and it looks like she'll be either successfully reinstated or she'll be paid compensation, but she literally just liked a tweet by another group, which was an official group. It might not been the ONA, but it was a group of that nature, saying, liking what they're saying about what is effectively a genocide being committed in Palestine by Israel. And then she loses a job. And that's mild compared to what some people have had happen to them in Europe.
Yes, but let's be honest, as an economist, if you didn't write, what the mainstream that expected was more or less at the end of your career, or you'd end up in a fourth-rate university.
Which is what happened to me. Yeah. I mean, but there are only a handful of non-orthodox economists like me who have managed to get some sort of presence despite that history. But like I began at, when I did my undergrad, it was the University of Sydney, which would have been sort of globally certainly top 25 uni. I then went to the University of New South Wales, which would have been a top 50. Worked most of my life in the University of Western Sydney, which had a great economics department, but was as a university ranked in the top 200 or 300. And I finished my career at Kingston, which again I managed to hire some great staff for, but again non-mainstream. And that's getting close to the 1,000th on the planet. The more non-orthodox you are and the more prominent you get, the lower the quality of university you end up teaching in. And therefore the mainstream gets reinforced at the Cambridge and the Oxfords and Harvards and so on, and the same bullshit that we know is bullshit that you can pull apart using the research of mainstream economists. That's what's been promulgated as economic analysis around the planet.
Yes, but this is something that's permeating the whole of Western society. And I think one of the best examples with regard to Ukraine, the war in Ukraine and Palestine, are John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs. Absolute the primary academics in their field, they don't get onto mainstream media anymore. They both have to work in alternative media. And these are really leading thinkers, highly, anyone you speak to, highly respected. But of course, you don't want to, be in contact with these people. No one here, at least the political class, does not want them on the media, in mainstream media, whatever. So we literally banned, just like with Economist. And it's not only there. We've had this with in Germany, for example. I actually remember the people who were genetic manipulation of food. They were all just couldn't get any jobs anymore. Had to leave the country, find a job somewhere else. And this is not only going on in academia. The whole. I think this is something Noam Chomsky did very well, which is simply explaining. You aren't getting anywhere in mainstream media if you think differently.
Yeah, if you don't get to be sitting in that chair, if you don't espouse views that are acceptable to the mainstream, to the powers that be, and you get a filtering effect coming out of that amplifies when you look at it is disgustingly stupid research that justifies the current power structure, but doesn't have anything to do with how the power structure actually works.
Which is why the climate movement has to stop with this follow the science, because it's...
No, I think you will listen to the bloody side. It says they at least know what the hell they're talking about.
Right.
And this is what I find so frustrating, which is one reason I'm trying to get scientists to realize that it's the economists who shut them out of the dialogue. Because what scientists have been doing what scientists do. You find a research topic that interests you. You look at the previous history of the research, you see where you can contribute something new, you write your paper, you publish in a referee journal, and you think that, and then you keep on doing it, and you find absolutely nothing is happening in policy, and you're thinking, but I've written all these research papers, and there's this huge history of data that shows you what's going to happen if you continue. And why are you still going down this trend? Well, the answer is partly the power structure effects you're talking about, but certainly the contribution of economists to that. Because if we had decent economists, people actually understand capitalism and understand that you can't have. Conventional economic theory teaches students you can have output by combining labor and capital in a factory. And the line that got me into saying I can actually make a contribution here was one that occurred to me in another friend's place, Bob Ayres. And Bob Ayres has been a physicist who got involved in economics, was trying to bring energy, the role of energy, into production in economic models. So he said you cannot have a model of production which doesn't include energy. And that was, Bob's work was the beginning with a guy called Kummel. I've never actually met Kummel, but he was a German researcher, a mathematician that Bob worked with to build alternative models that included a role for energy. And though I respected the work and I liked it, and I actually wrote at one stage that I'm going to base my work on what Bob has done, I still didn't like what they had done practically, because they still at one point in the model, the mathematical model there is, which is called line X, linear exponential, I think that stands for. They had an index number for an output, which was a product of labor times capital times energy. And that's the way the mainstream, whenever they think about energy, they think, well, you've got labor and you've got capital, and if we have to include energy, then we just tack it on as a third factor of production. And the equation we use as output is a multiplicative result of multiplying technology by labor, by capital, by energy, in such a way that if you doubled labor and capital and energy, you double output. That's the technical way they do it. And I didn't like that, because I thought, look, that implies you can hit a factory with a lightning bolt and goods will come out the other side. Or you can throw an atom bomb into a factory and it'll produce goods. Energy is not independent of labor and capital. There's something wrong with it. So I was actually in Bob's house, just similar to you and me. So I was staying overnight while I'm traveling. And I was working with Bob on this whole idea. So I was staying at the house for about a week or so. And his house is full of statues, absolutely packed with them. And I was went to the bathroom, the old man's house, or going to the toilet late at night, and walking back, and I just glanced at all these statues, and this little thought popped in my head. And it was, labor without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture.
Exactly.
And I rushed into my room, and I sat down, and 10 minutes later, I'd worked out what that concept does to the mathematics of production theory by neoclassicals. It was ridiculous how easy it was. So that's where I brought in the role of energy there. And what that means is, what economists have done is fool themselves 1.5 centuries that you can produce output without inputs from the natural world.
I know we're going off on a tangent right now, but I think it's an important question beyond economics, which is that these people don't understand it, or is it they don't want to understand it? Because we were speaking a moment ago, but your career depends on...
Yeah, it's a weird mixture, because my analogy would be, imagine that I found the body of Jesus Christ. I'm an archaeologist over in Palestine, and I managed to find a grave, and I prove that this is actually JC, and mum and dad aren't too far away. And I go to the Vatican and knock on the little tag. I found the body of Jesus Christ. Would you like to have a look? Fuck off. They'd have the Vatican guards coming and spearing me to get rid of me. They don't want to know in that sense. But they also believe. There's a combination of the two. So economists, the thing which is seductive about economics, and I know this from when I was a young student, I fell for the whole line as well, hook, line, and sinker. And what it implies is you have a perfect, effectively anarchist society. The capitalism from the mainstream way of thinking is an anarchy, because anarchy means no government. So here you have a system with no government. Here you have consumers on one side, producers on the other, some people doing work, others being capitalists and so on. Consumers have their set of tastes, and those tastes determine what is produced in the factories. Labor and capital have to come together to produce the output, and they get paid their marginal product, which says basically workers get their contribution to production and capitalists get paid their contribution to production. There's no power, there's no coercion. They're preferred models, what they call perfect competition. And that is, there's so many producers producing every commodity, but the producers can't coordinate, and so many workers competing with each other for the wage that they can't coordinate. So there's no power. Now that is an incredibly seductive vision of an anarchist society. And that's what they think capitalism is. What it could be, if only they could reform away and get rid of the trade unions, minimize the government as much as possible. Maybe one of these days abolish monopolies. That's not quite so important, But that's what they do. That's the primary thing. So this is why it's so seductive to them. And when you get sucked in by it, it is a compelling vision of a perfect society. So when you go into an economics degree, you don't become like a scientist who's trained to understand quantum mechanics or astrophysics or Einstein's equations or chemical bonds or, all that sort of stuff. You get trained to believe that you can create a perfect society if only other people would get out of your way and let you do it.
So it's also the difference between economics and then political economics, because as a political economist, 2,000 years, it's 2,000, but as long as capitalism has existed, 300 years let it be, the system is not anarchic. It's manipulated.
Even the anarchy itself is false. I mean, this is what I've really been doing, is showing the idea that this is how the system works. Even if you could make that system work, it would not work like the textbook say it to. That was the major hole. That's why I dived into the whole area and became a critic, starting when I was 18 years old. And Frank Stillwell never understands why it was so important to me. But one lecture by Frank Stillwell was the original foundation professor of political economy at Sydney Uni, in a department which I helped bring about by the strikes that we did as students back in 1973. One lecture by Frank drove a freight train right through that anarchist vision that I was totally accepting of at the time. And that was what's called the theory of the second best. And this is published, it was Kelvin Lancaster, and I've forgotten the other author, published an article called The General Theory of the Second Best. And what that said was, imagine you're 2 steps from this economic nirvana. Okay? So the nirvana has atomistic firms who therefore don't even know the other firms exist, let alone collaborate or collude with them. Workers who aren't organized into trade unions. Okay? So in that situation, you'll get the perfect outcome. Capitalists get the marginal product of capital. Workers get the marginal product of labor. No coercion. That's perfect. That's perfection. That's what you're aiming for. But the theory of the second best said, what if you're 2 steps away from that nirvana? Okay? So there are employer associations and there are trade unions. What's the situation that applies then? And you can do a mathematical model of that. So what they work with, when economists learn the basic of this, two intersecting supply and demand curves. When you include collusion by employers and collusion by workers, you get another 2 curves, the marginal social product curves, I think they're called. And what Frank showed is if you do that, you then find there's an indeterminate range where the wage can be above or below the marginal product, but there's a defined range for the 2. Okay. If you abolish, the obvious one is to choose abolishing the trade union, but that's what's been done in the last 4 or 5 decades. If you abolish the trade union using completely mainstream theory, you provably show that you've reduced social welfare by getting rid of one, but not both what they call imperfections. And so that meant that I wrote an essay, one of my first essays at university, arguing in favor of abolishing trade unions and monopolies. Okay? Thank God it's been lost. Yeah. I don't need to be, dragged. Look, you wrote this, if you think. So I swallowed the whole thing. And then Frank does this proof and shows that according to the theory of the second best, if you have both trade unions and monopolies, abolishing one or the other will make the social outcome worse. So the only way to do it is to abolish everything simultaneously. And I thought, well, that's bullshit. You can't do it. So this what I thought was a perfect argument for what is effectively an anarchist society, as capitalism, was flawed. And I thought, this is ridiculous. All you've got to do is bring in a bit of realism to say, well, there are trade unions and there are also employer associations. And then you say you abolish one of the, you make it worse. This has got to be a shitty theory. There's something wrong here. So I looked at my textbook, no mention of the theory of the second best. And I left that lecture and went downstairs in the Merriweather building at Sydney University, made a beeline for the economics library. And I said, I can't trust the textbooks. There's nothing about this. Maybe the journals have got it. So I grabbed a copy of the latest copy that was bound at that stage, was the 1966, I think it was, edition of the Journal of the Economics Society. What they call it, the main, the economics, I think it's called the Journal of Economics, coming out of Cambridge University. And there was a set of papers by a Marxist. And I thought, what's a Marxist doing publishing them? And it was Baduri and some top-class Marxist economists critiquing neoclassical economics. I said, hang on a sec, I never heard that Marxists were actually economists or rebels. And so And then got a later edition, and there's an article by Paul Samuelson. Now, that's a name I recognize, obviously. And the title of the article was A Summing Up. What's he summing up? So I opened up the article and I found he's summing up a discussion, a debate between academics, economists at Cambridge University in the UK and academics at the MIT in Cambridge, America. So it's called the Cambridge Controversies. He was summing it up and conceding defeat. Okay, the final paragraph of that paper says, if all this makes you nostalgic for the old-time parables of neoclassical thought, we must appraise ourselves as scholars are not born to live an easy existence. We must accept and confront the facts of life. And I thought, wow, he's admitting he lost. What does he say in his textbook, which was not in textbook? I had a copy of it, right? 7071 textbook. No mention. Okay. And I thought, this is mendacious. I'm being lied to by the textbook writer. He's conceded defeat here in the journals. He's continuing to push the same shit, which I now realize was shit. So that was the beginning of it. So we're on a long way from where your original question was. But
No, because what you're saying is
they do believe it. Okay, it's a passionate belief in an ideal society.
yes, but it's the fear of the loss of a perfect world, which is what they've created.
Yeah, it's perfect world, and suddenly you think it's not perfect. And what do you do? Do you admit the problem? Would you retreat back into believing perfection?
Oh.
And just like if I went to the Vatican and showed them the body of Jesus Christ, they'd spear me, they'd find some way to denigrate me, throw me out at the up in the Tiber River. And then they'd go back to believing the same old, and they'd be teaching it, say, I hope nobody goes and finds that body again. And that's what they'd be doing. So that's the basic nature of it.
So, yeah, you have to not forget that for a human being, back to religion,
Sure. Like the microphone. We're not used to the technology, so apologies for occasional.
Yeah, being years old and then, being a priest and then suddenly discovering, I don't believe in God.
Yeah.
And it would be the same thing. I think it's a terrible crisis. Plus, you're almost at your pension at 60. But
you keep on going for 5 more years and retire, and then you can go and have all those massages you've been denying yourself, or if maybe not. It's a combination of belief. That's why people believe in God. It's this wonderful, all you got to do is what God tells you and you'll go to heaven and live in perfection. This is heaven on earth. In fact, there's a particular neoclassical who I long ago blocked on Twitter. He's just a pain in the ass. But his blog about economics is called Utopia. You're standing in it. And they actually believe that capitalism is a utopia. And if only we can just reform it so it looks like the textbook, we'll be living in utopia. Now, what I've done instead is go back and read this literature and find, in fact, all the ideas about convergence to equilibrium and absence of cycles and impossibility of breakdown and things working better without a government are all mathematically invalid. So what you then get is this thing you're talking about with the priest, who sort of goes through the whole beliefs, the whole thing. Some of them never want to look at those books, so they don't even read the articles. Others read them and think, oh, shit, do I actually acknowledge that, or do I continue living with this beautiful vision and get to my retirement age? And most of them do that.
Right, which brings us back to the topic we began with, which is this belief that you can reform a society which has one goal, which is growth and redistribution of income from the bottom to the top. And why should they reform it? Why would the ruling class want to reform
even if it's not perfect as the textbook says, it's pretty damn good for them.
Right.
Like the funny thing is most economists work as bureaucrats in government departments or as academics in the universities, which have been privatized by their own ideas and have stuffed up their own lifestyles. They're not particularly wealthy. They're not making a fortune out of this stuff. So it's not that they're saying what they're paid to say. They're being paid to say what they believe in because it's consistent with the interests of the ruling class in that sense. But they're not particularly benefiting from it. So the danger, this is why I regard economists as extremely dangerous. The most dangerous person isn't somebody who's saying what they're saying because they're paid to say. The most dangerous person is somebody who believes what they're saying. Because the one who's being paid, and I use this as an unusual example to use, but you can't pay somebody enough to fly a plane into a World Trade Center. Somebody who believes will fly that plane into the World Trade Center. So we've got economists from the latter category. And they believe they're doing good, and they're setting us up for catastrophe.
Right. Which is, again, the same. You can see the same for the political class, and they're all setting us up for catastrophe. I think you have your fanatics, the climate deniers and whatever.
Yeah.
But, you don't have. You have to be pretty blind not to see climate change already happening. I was sitting here in the midst of another drought in Berlin, with temperatures that are very, very high. This is not normal.
There's what, 27 degrees outside, wasn't it, yesterday, I think?
That was a cool day.
Wow.
Most of the time we've been over
late
30.
August.
Yeah.
And the beginning of September. When's the formal start of autumn? It's
It's in September sometime.
something 20 and 22nd. Yeah, in the final throes of summer anyway.
Right.
And normally you're down to what, about 15 degrees, 20 degrees, that sort of range.
In the evenings it cools off. But anyway, the more frightening thing is the lack of rain.
Okay.
It's just doesn't rain. And this is every summer now. You have 1 month of no rain, at least once.
Yeah.
Quite often twice.
Yeah.
Yes, and we had March. We had no rain, which is very unusual for we're talking about Central Europe. Central and Northern Europe.
Yeah.
So, and it's the same thing. This is, what someone keeps saying with regard to Gaza. We're seeing genocide in real time. That used to not be possible. It went through the media.
Yeah.
So people can see it. And of course, you're going to have people who are going to deny it and say, these are all, these films on given the manufactured or whatever. But this is the point. That I think men, and you're going to notice this when many people can see reality on the one side and the reality they're supposed to accept on the other side, and realizing they're getting further and further.
Yeah. So, this is becoming more obvious. But I've read an enormous number of climate science papers, certainly more than 500. And so I've picked up, I'm not a scientist, so I've got to rely upon the research. I know some of the people who do this work, and I trust them. They're genuine scientists in the full sense of the word. Their models are fairly accurate. Okay. And what their predictions have been that effectively the Sahel region, the climate that exists as the Sahara Desert now is moving, with climate change, is moving north and will occupy most of southern Europe and a fair bit of northern Europe. So what that implies is an area that people, how many people? Perhaps 650 million, 1 billion wealthy white people live in, is going to become uninhabitable. And it's a dual thing. It's firstly, there's going to be more, the drought region that is this above the Sahara is going to move north. But there'll be more rainfall at the same time, because every 1 degree increase in temperature increases the moisture carrying capacity of the atmosphere by 7%. So we're already about 10% more moisture in the atmosphere than there was before climate change began about 1750. So that implies when storms hit, they're going to be catastrophic. It won't be the gentle rainfall that's enabled England and most of Europe to have broad-acre agriculture, and you don't need to worry about irrigation because it falls out of the sky fairly reliably. Those days are over. First of all, most of the time it's going to be drought. But secondly, when it does rain, you don't want to be there. You're going to get washed away.
Exactly. Where we see these floods come.
Yeah.
And again, it's a natural phenomena.
Yeah.
It's not natural anymore.
No, it's unnatural. And again, that's what I'm expecting, is that a lot of your deniers would be country people. They think of a bunch of lefty greenies in the city who are coming out with this garbage, and, the climate's always changed, that sort of nonsense falls in with them. But they're the ones we're going to see, sometimes they have a year where there's rainfall's normal and they do pretty well. Other times it's actually an improvement. They're suddenly catastrophic. Either the drought comes along and their crop gets wiped out, or they have hailstones that destroy everything in a day and overnight, or they have such high temperatures that the crop gets cooked on the vine and you have nothing to sell. So I think that what we're going to see is that the centres that are the major locations of denial sympathies right now, which are largely rural, they're possibly the ones who are going to say, holy shit, this stuff is serious. Why are you fuckers in the city not doing anything about it? And the real fun would be if the rural people decide, well, we've got enough for ourselves.
Well, this is already happening, Steve. I look at the prices of good that are olive oil. I think orange. These were things that were once luxuries, but then became cheap.
Commodities everywhere. Yeah.
Right, and now it's going back to being luxury. And you can see it's normal that you have bad harvests and good harvests, whatever. But in the meantime, it's all looking like for harvest. And not only 1 year, but 2 years. And then you might have a good one in between. But then it gets worse in the next round of for harvest. You'll see this in the price of products. Vegetables, fruit, bread, everything, the staples.
And this is actually one of the scientists that I work with, Tim Garrett, who's one of the world's leading experts. You're going to love this. He's the expert on snowflakes. Tim's a great bloke. We're hoping to catch up with him again in December. And working with a mathematician, Matthias Praselli, and we're trying to bring out realistic, well-founded, absolutely foundation models of economics, which rely upon inputs from the natural environment to produce anything. That's the great fallacy. That's why economists haven't seen this coming. They've mentally conditioned themselves to models in which you can produce output with labor and capital. They don't even think about inputs from the natural environment anymore. That's why they've been so blind. So we're trying to do the foundation work to say, what models do you need to have so you're actually physically acknowledge that without energy to produce nothing and without material to transform into other forms for consumption by humans, you don't have commodities either. So you've got to have that natural foundation. So we're working together on that. But it's him. I've lost my train of thought to some extent.
It's about the snowflakes.
Sorry?
You're right, snowflakes.
Snowflakes. Well, yeah, his the work that they do is so detailed. The experimental instruments they design so that they can actually measure this stuff makes what economists do look like worse than child's play. Because like Tim had to invent a machine which could photograph falling snowflakes at such a resolution, and they're falling out at night half the time, at such resolution that he could determine the shapes of the snowflakes and then get the mathematics of the shapes of snowflakes. So when people like Richard Werner, for example, hello Richard, denigrate what scientists are doing, they have no idea how dedicated these people are to understanding that specific deep topic they've taken. So one of my great regrets is that what we're doing, what we're letting happen by the collapse of civilization, which I think is almost inevitable, a lack of action so far, is that the knowledge the science community has accumulated in the last quarter millennium, ever since Galileo, so it goes back further, but certainly under the Industrial Revolution, a huge part of what we've learned has come out of the fact we've exploited fossil fuels. Without all the fossil fuels, with the knowledge we've got, would never have been accumulated. We're likely to lose it all.
Well, the thing I once wrote, I don't know, and I think I did mean it seriously, where I said, just like we have political economists, we also need political climate scientists.
That's true.
And this is what's missing, or it's started, it's getting, there are some really good climate
Peter
scientists.
Kalmus, for example. Peter's been extremely active, tied, literally locking himself to the door of a shell, that sort of thing. Jim Hansen, Jim was one of the first to raise the alarm. Jim actually spoke to Congress back in the 60s, maybe in the 60s or 70s, warning what's coming. And this is why I find the movie Don't Look Up such a brilliant parody of what we're going through with climate change, because when Jennifer Lawrence and Leonardo DiCaprio playing the roles of the scientists who discovered the meteor and the scientists who predicted its path and shorts on a collision course, they get into talk to the president. So it's 99.7% likely to hit the Earth. Oh, so there's a chance it won't. What? And then they get kicked out of the room and try to go on media, and rather than being taken seriously, the journalist is playing with Leonardo's leg, and kicking them out. There's an extent to which our political class trivializes all the actual system they're supposed to be running because they're having a good time out of it. They're doing pretty damn well. There's a superficiality to their thinking. And your people who rise to the top are not the creme de la creme.
No, to the contrary. That's why they get to the top. But interesting point is, what's changed. How old is the film now? How old is the film? About 5 years ago?
Oh, no, not that old. About 2 or 3 years.
Nowadays, I don't think the climate scientists would even make it onto the news.
In fact, I'm actually involved in some attempts to get this issue back into the media. And I've been told by journalists that when they talk about climate change, they say, not that topic again.
Exactly.
Can we do something else? So we've got to find an angle that will mean this topic will get onto the media. And what it means is, it's almost like, again, I make analogies to World War II all the time because that's the last time we mobilized human resources on a grand scale to fight what was agreed to be an evil by virtually everybody. We didn't do it until you had 250,000 British troops on the shores of Dunkirk about to be slaughtered after Poland had fallen, after France had fallen. And then finally, Churchill has been anti-Hitler for decades, for quite a while, gets the chance to take over and say it's going to be blood, sweat and tears to be able to survive. So that's the change in sentiment you need. But people, we had Chamberlain going off to shake his hand. I've seen arguments Chamberlain's actually doing that to enable British industry to have time to gear up.
That's a very generous interpretation.
I know. I've seen that's one of the extremes I've seen. But otherwise, it was, peace in our time. And then you forget about it. It's not important. Holy shit, we're about to lose 250,000 troops. Okay. So the extent to which the dominant elements in our society trivialized anything which is going to change the trajectory our society is on, that's what's biting us right now.
And, we're even seeing there is a change. Let's be quite honest. I think this whole authoritarian liberalism is crumbling. And you can see the panic. Look at I think one of the best examples is what Macron is doing in France right now, where you have a mandate for one party in we aren't even, the left, we aren't even considering letting them, form a government. We won't even give them a chance.
Mélenchon?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And we're going to see more and more of this as this. Yeah, I did some number crunching after the EU election and discovered that in Germany, in the EU parliamentary election, the legacy parties, if you take their share of the vote and you take the number of people who voted, you only have a third of the population to support them. We saw the same thing in France, and then we saw the same thing in Britain. Yeah. Although you had the usual Labour Tory parties, but the number of people who are voting for them
was trivial. And the state of Australia is the same thing. Same sort of trend. The share of the major parties has been heading down for the last 50 years. And now it's getting to the point where minority parties actually have a chance of, first of all, pushing whichever party wins into a minority position. And then secondly, at some point, maybe getting more votes and actually being able to form a governing party of independence. So there is a generalized sense of disillusion in the political classes of the West.
And there's a reality that's coming home to the West, which is the U.S. got rid of the rule of law and introduced a rule-based order. And most people didn't quite realize the sleight of hand that was. Of course, we're seeing it in Ukraine. We're seeing it in Gaza. But it's also happening here. And I think an important... I won't go down this road. We'll get lost. But it's coming home. And people are starting to realize, wait a minute, this is not the law. This is someone's interpreting it to their own advantage.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like Boris Johnson and twerps like that getting to be leaders of major societies like Britain. And they're in it for the parties. I mean, they're not all that trivial. But the extent to which you've got your basic attitude is the role of the ruling class is to rule. But the role of the ruling class is to live on the fat of the land and have a great time, and then retire and write your memoirs. And so that trivial level of leader is taking over now. So you look at it now, again, I'm not praising Churchill, but you look at a Churchillian type personality and the extent to which he stuck his neck out and put not quite his life on the line, but his future reputation on the line, versus bloody Boris Johnson, who thinks he's the reincarnation of Churchill. The twits, bloody Donald Trump and the idiots. I like even
completely senile. Still being president.
Macron's not senile, but like what do you call it?
No, I'm talking about Biden.
Huh?
About Biden. Who is president. And people knew for 2 years he's senile until it finally came out in that debate.
But in that sense, Macron is slightly different. He's obviously much younger. But he was En Marche was his party's name, wasn't it? So, and managed to sweep aside the previous political. And now he's pushing an economic style agenda. And then he believed that would work. And I remember talking with Yanis Varoufakis, and Yanis actually had a lot of time for Macron because he said Macron is the only politician he dealt with who said, I'll do X to support you. And when it came to crunch, he did X to support Yanis. So Yanis has respect for the personal integrity of Macron. But he says at the same time he's deluded. He's followed the same neoliberal neoclassical economic-founded vision of how the world operates. It doesn't operate that way. It's going to blow up in his face, and that's what's happening now.
But I think it was Jeffrey Sachs who in an interview said he's never, he's been around, he's an economist, but he's also just been around everywhere in Western Europe, not Europe, even Eastern Europe. He knows the ropes pretty well. And he recently said he's never seen such a low quality of political leadership.
Yeah.
That's why he has no hope, because these people are not capable of solving problem. Yeah, I think we all do.
As much as you might have taken Richard Nixon, for example, Nixon and Kissinger, they were the ones who opened up relationship with China. They ended the mild Cold War with China was ended by Nixon agreeing to send Kissinger to go and negotiate with. I'm getting my personalities mixed up. I'm thinking China line, but that's Vietnam. But there was Kissinger went to on a secret mission to China before the end of the Vietnam War at Nixon's behest. That's a level of cleverness and capacity for intrigue and stepping outside the boundaries of your own political ideology that I would never expect Boris Johnson to be able to do. They're just too damn stupid. So yeah, it's an incredibly low caliber of political leaders these days.
If you want to learn 50 years plus of real economics from me in only 7 weeks, go to apply.stevecoonfree.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and interact with a great group of like-minded people.